So from Modus, I'm delighted to have here this evening Rob Bars, who's a principal with Modus Planning, Design and Engagement, and also Patrick Osterdick, who's the project manager from Modus. And we also have Carly Rimmel, who's the project manager from the district. I also believe that a colleague, Eric Lambertson, who's the district's communication manager, is also in the call. And I believe that there may be members of council also in attendance. First of all, I'd also like to acknowledge that this work to create a new OCP is taking place on the traditional territories of the WSÁNEĆ communities. And once again, in phase 3, we look forward to working with them on this plan that we hope will continue to build trust, relationships and long-term partnerships with them. And we do have a meeting scheduled with them later this month. And so, as I mentioned, this is phase 3 as virtual open house, and Rob and Patrick will be taking you through the agenda that we have for this evening. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Rob, who will take you through the agenda that we have planned for the next 2.5 hours.
Great, thank you so much, Brian, sorry. And great to see everybody. Thank you for attending tonight. In phase 3, we are moving finally towards in-person engagement, and we have a number of events lined up which we'll tell you about at the end, which are in person, but we did want to give you the opportunity for those of you who prefer to attend online, this opportunity tonight. So yeah, great to have you with us. So in a moment, I'll just take you through some guidelines for our dialogue tonight, and also just some guidance on the Zoom platform for those of you who are not familiar. Then we'll take you through the draft vision and goals, and we have a quick poll at the end of the vision and goals that we'll ask you to participate in. And then the bulk of tonight is really focused on the draft policy directions. So we hope to get your comments on these 6 key themes of the draft OCP. So after each block of policy directions, Patrick will present the policy directions, and then we'll pause and hear your questions and hopefully be able to provide some responses. So when you're asking questions, you can do that in the chat, or you can do it, put your hand up, your virtual hand up, and ask them verbally. And then finally, at the end, we'll just tell you about the next steps and the other opportunities for engagement we have that we have lined up. So most of you, I'm sure, are familiar with Zoom by now. It's become the default platform for a lot of these kind of online workshops and meetings. But just in case, I just want to make sure you're familiar with the various tools. So we ask people to keep yourselves on mute unless you're talking. So down in the bottom left-hand corner of your screen should be a microphone, a little microphone symbol, and you can turn your mic on and off using that. And so it's off if the red line is through it. And there's also a video there. So ideally, if you could keep your video on, that would be great. Just nice to see faces. But if you prefer to turn it off, that's fine as well. In the middle of your screen should be a little call out box with the word chat underneath it. So this is where you can type in your comments. So when we get to the Q&A portion of the meeting, you can write your questions in the chat, or as I say, you can also verbalize them. And to do that, you would use the reactions button, which is also at the bottom of your screen. And under reactions, you should be able to raise your hand. So that's another way of asking a question. And then finally, in the top right-hand corner of the screen are different ways to view the platform. So you can either look at kind of everybody, which is called gallery, or you can just view the speaker only. So there are different ways to view the information while we're presenting this presentation. So that's a quick overview of Zoom. Just some quick guidelines, if I may, for our dialogue session tonight, or our open house session tonight. So obviously we come to this in the spirit of engagement, and we're keen to hear and learn from you. And so we want to make sure we honor our time together. We have limited time, about 2.5 hours total. So let's make the most of it. And if you do have questions or comments, if you could please keep them as focused as possible, so that we can hear from as many people as possible. We want to share in the responsibility for an effective meeting. So, we're organizing it and taking you through this agenda, but we hope that you will help us keep on track as well. We recognize and respect that there's a great deal of experience in the room. So, people have lived in North Saanich a long time, have come to the meeting with different experiences. So we really want to make sure we respect that diversity of experience and the wisdom in the room. Everyone has a voice, so we want to make sure you all get a chance to say something if you'd like to tonight in response to each of the policy directions. So we'll try and keep this moving quickly so that you all have a chance to speak up. If you don't like something, if you can please make sure you're challenging the idea or the concept rather than an individual. A lot of these ideas have been and policy directions have been put together kind of in reaction to what we've heard through the process, and it's a joint effort. So please keep your comments focused on the ideas or the concepts. And then finally, if you could make sure that you speak clearly so everybody understands, and also just participate in a way that you're actively listening to others when they're speaking as well. So appreciate just the opportunity to go through those few guidelines. In terms of our process, the overall project is a 5-phase process. We started off 18 months ago or so in background research and looking at kind of the existing situation in North Saanich, some of the existing documents, and really planning the overall process. Phase 2, we looked at community visioning. We had a survey and web panels and a number of community dialogue sessions and workbooks. And we got some really good input from the community during that phase about what they would like to see and what they would not like to see. So we're here in phase 3 right now, where we're exploring policy directions. And at the end of this phase, we hope to be actually creating the first draft of the OCP. So the dialogue sessions that we held last week, the open houses this week and next week, and also a Southeast Quadrant workshop are really going to be key input into that drafting process. And we will summarize all the input that we hear from this phase 3 in a phase 3 report that we'll take to council with some recommendations. And then phase 4 is where we actually finalize and refine the OCP. And then finally, we'll get to phase 5, which is where we take the OCP in the form of a bylaw in front of council for potential adoption. So that's our process. I'm now going to turn it over to Patrick Ostrick, who's our project director, who will take you through the vision and goals and some of the policy directions as well.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Rob. So the draft vision and goals are a product of much of the engagement that we conducted over the course of the second phase of this process. And it's been a really active process, one that we have now been sort of refining the draft vision on a few different times with the advisory working group and with council. So we've arrived at this draft vision that we'd love to test with you tonight, as well as a set of draft goals. So once I've presented these to you, we'll then launch a poll, and you'll be able to leave a little bit of feedback in the poll as to whether or not you support the draft vision and the draft goals. And you can also leave some comments in the chat as well if you'd like to give a little bit more information on what it is that you might like or dislike from these from the draft vision and draft goals. So I'll just read it out for you here. So the draft vision is: in 2040, North Saanich is a community of diverse neighborhoods amongst forests and fields surrounded by the sea. Strong partnerships with Wasanich, Sydney, and Central Saanich communities provide opportunities for regional collaboration. These partnerships, along with the quiet countryside and the abundance of natural features, provide residents with a rewarding quality of life. Neighborhoods are welcoming and inclusive, while providing a place for all to feel at home. We take climate action seriously, and our choices have reduced the community's carbon footprint. Residents can find jobs in a resilient economy that is anchored by our role as a regional transportation hub and a marine and agricultural center of activity. Our farmlands are protected and rich, and people from all over the region celebrate our local food at the farm market and farm stands alike. The remarkable network of coastlines, rural lands, forests, and parks that distinguish North Saanich are accessible, interconnected, biodiverse, and protected for future generations. And then the draft goals, so there's 7 of them in total. The first being around regional collaboration, being founded on trusting relationships with Saanich, Sydney, and Central Saanich communities. Natural areas and ecological systems are healthy and accessible and resilient as the second goal. Neighborhoods are connected and caring, the third goal. The fourth being strong action to address the climate crisis is reducing greenhouse gas emissions and helping us adapt to a changing climate. The fifth is agricultural lands are protected and farmed sustainably while contributing to a thriving local food system. The sixth is greater housing diversity helps residents from all walks of life to attain a home. And the final goal here is the local economy is increasingly waste-free and anchored by key regional transportation infrastructure. And so with that, I will just launch the draft vision and goals poll here, and we'll give you some time to answer the questions that pop up onto your screen there. And if you have any questions or comments at all, please feel free to add them to the chat. Maybe I'll put the draft vision back up there for you to be able to read. So it looks like we have about 10 out of 26 who've responded so far. Slowly climbing up. We'll give you a few more moments here to select your answer. And yes, I see a comment in the, or a question in the chat by Irfane here. This looks like the same as the survey, is that correct? Yes. So the draft vision and the draft goals that we're presenting throughout these engagement activities are similar across the board in all of the, we haven't changed the wording across these engagement activities in phase 3. So it's consistent. All right, so we're just waiting for a few more here and give you 30 seconds more for those who are still hoping to answer the question or the poll. All right, so 5 seconds left. All right, so I'm just going to close the poll here. And we'll share the results to everyone. So it looks like there's a fairly large percentage of those who are participating tonight, about 50% said mostly. So it seems to be hitting some of the more positive notes there. And then a few also who are saying, you know, a bit unsure or somewhat, you know, hitting the right notes in terms of the draft vision and goals. There are a few who feel like perhaps perhaps they aren't quite hitting the right mark. So I'd encourage anyone who does feel as though the vision and goals don't fully match with your own expectations to, you know, either leave comments in the chat there so that we can understand a little bit more as to why that is. And we will certainly be considering this feedback with all of the feedback that we're receiving this phase into crafting, hopefully an even stronger and more reflective vision and goals of the community here. So feel free to do that. I'm just going to stop sharing here the poll, and we can maybe move on to the next part of the open house. Thank you everyone for participating in that. All right. So with that, we'll move right into draft policy directions. And so the really important piece here to acknowledge is that there's many interlinkages between the 6 major OCP themes that we're tackling over the course of this OCP update. Today, we're going to speak to all 6 OCP themes, but I think it's really important that as we look at these policy directions, that we also understand that a policy that's perhaps related to agriculture and food systems might also have an impact on sort of marine and land-based natural environments. So just because that policy direction fits within one of the OCP themes doesn't mean it's not necessarily related or connected to some of the others here. So we'll do our best to kind of point out some of those connections, but it's just to say that we acknowledge the interrelatedness of these policy directions, and many of them do obviously hit many of this or several of the different themes. So as part of phase 2, we'll start off with marine and land-based natural environment. Some of the key things that we heard in the engagement are that these types of natural environments should be protected through regulation and enforcement. That natural areas should be accessible for public and recreational use where possible. That public education and awareness are really important for restoration and for preservation efforts. Strong partnerships with the province and First Nations, and I think also perhaps with our neighbors in Central Saanich and in the town of Sydney, will ensure that some of these conservation efforts are coordinated and connected across the region. New development should be limited to protect the district's existing green and natural spaces. So we know that residents really value and cherish those natural spaces. Restoring marine and foreshore environments, reestablishing clam gardens, and reintroducing native plant species are really important for the WSÁNEĆ Leadership Council and the Indigenous communities that we share this land with. And habitat restoration and protection of at-risk species is also very important. So some of the policy directions that look to try and address some of this feedback that we've heard through phase 2. The first being around blue-green networks. So we think that by planning for blue-green networks, we can map some key wildlife and plant habitat, the corridors that connect them, and identify any kind of gaps that might exist in those blue-green networks so that we can support more connected ecosystems. So the idea here would be to create a map of all the existing kind of protected natural assets and natural features in North Saanich, and then identify some of those gaps where additional greening strategies like whether hedgerows, street trees, or other types of strategies could really connect those natural environments together. We're also exploring a policy direction around marine environments, so looking to encourage shoreline property owners to adopt a green shores approach where practical, reviewing marine environmental development permit area guidelines to incorporate those green shore principles. And those are, for those who don't understand, a green shore approach to marine environments is a soft approach. So it's using, rather than retaining walls, using sort of natural native species, beach environments, and a bit of a softer kind of progression into the foreshore as a way to kind of absorb some of the storm surges and some of the wave action that typically hits a waterfront environment. We also want to identify where clam gardens should be restored and support projects that reestablish this type of local practice by WSÁNEĆ peoples. Looking to regulate the design and location of docks as well, while respecting WSÁNEĆ treaty rights and access to the foreshore. In terms of a natural assets strategy, this is also a really key component of our marine and land-based environment policy directions, but natural asset strategies help us account for the value and the services that ecosystems provide our communities through financial planning and asset management programs. So really the intent is to ensure that we're maintaining the quality and the resilience of our traditional infrastructure while protecting the natural environment. So the idea here would be to develop a municipal natural asset management strategy, once the OCP is adopted. Forests and the tree canopy, so looking at a community forest management strategy to identify some of the important forests throughout the district and some of the unique tree canopies that exist as well. And that way we can tailor preservation and enhancement strategies for each one of those types of forests and tree canopies. Looking at some of the riparian areas. So we're looking to review and strengthen some of the environmental development permit area guidelines, especially those around water courses, to help safeguard those sensitive riparian ecosystems from development and human activity that might encroach on those areas. And so this could mean wider setbacks from some riparian areas or more detailed protection measures within those areas as well. And another component that's really important to WSÁNEĆ communities is to regularly monitor the district streams to ensure healthy water flow and healthy water quality. And that'll help us identify issues when they arise as well. And finally, the last policy direction related to this OCP theme is around agricultural lands and wanting to maintain and enhance soil health to protect ecosystem health and biodiversity, and also help mitigate some of the impacts of climate change through carbon storage. So this is one of those policy directions, again, that has a really strong link to climate action, another OCP theme. And also looking at agricultural lands as a way to contribute to some of the wildlife corridors across the district by incorporating things like hedgerows and trees in and around farmland and protecting some of the naturally occurring wetlands as well. Now, both of these types of policy ideas here would probably remain as a sort of encouragement for farmers, seeing as much of the farmland is within the agricultural land reserve, but so that's important to note. So with that, I'll open it up to comments and questions, and I'll invite Rob to maybe moderate a little bit that session, this first.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Patrick. So we have probably 10 to 15 minutes for questions on each of these themes. So this is the first of 6. So I'd invite you to either put your questions in the chat, and some people have already been doing that. So thanks for that. That's great. If you prefer, you can also raise your digital hand. So if you go to reactions at the bottom of the screen, you should be able to choose raise hand. And I see already we have one person. So what I'll do is probably alternate between the on-screen raised hands and the chat questions. So the first question I'm seeing, and this is from Maya. And Maya, I may have to ask you to clarify here, but you've said, to what extent does that already exist versus how much must be done to make that real in relation to blue-green networks? I see. Okay. So how much of the blue-green networks that we saw on the natural areas map, Patrick, already exists versus what needs to be done to make that a reality? So I'd invite either Patrick or Carly or Brian to address that.
So to answer the question, we simply haven't yet really mapped out the blue-green networks across the district. I think there is a higher level kind of regional CRD blue-green network map, I believe, at the regional scale, but I think it's really important to dive into all the data that we have at the district and some of the data that exists at the provincial level as well, and other kind of environmental stakeholders, and map out exactly what are all the natural assets throughout the community so that we can identify some of the gaps. So we don't actually know yet, I would say, exactly what to extent the blue-green networks exist within North Saanich, but the idea would be to map that out and then to see, okay, are there ways to start creating some of these connections between ecosystems to make sure that they're healthy and they're connected.
And so some of the things that we might map are things like riparian corridors, so the vegetated areas along streams and rivers. That's one of the natural assets. The forested areas are, of course, natural assets. The coastline assets, beaches especially, are very rich ecological environments. The agricultural lands provide a very important ecological service to the district as well, but of course are also primarily for food production. So there are a number of different kind of assets that we would map in terms of that resource. Okay, I'm going to go to someone on screen here, Laurie Proust. Go ahead, Laurie.
Yeah. Hi, thank you. I this is my first time through, so learning as I go. But as I read the policy direction under blue-green networks, what stands out for me as missing is an acknowledgement that we're going to do this work of mapping our blue-green networks around residential and industrial and how they interact with residential and industrial, because recognizing that this is an official community plan of a community of people, I think that as we look at this, we have to always be looking at how it intersects. We have to be careful not to, I'll stop there. I think Patrick and Rob are nodding their heads, so they're picking up what I'm putting down, and that's the only comment I had. Thank you.
Yeah, just to quickly react, I mean, I think it's a great point, Laurie, that this is a community where people live, 12,000 people live, and so we do have to take into account how people are interacting, how land uses are interacting with those natural environments. It's not a blank slate here by any means, and so I think you make a great point that, yeah, those kind of balanced perspectives need to be taken into account. Thank you for that. Okay, so going to the second question in the chat here, Bernadette has asked, what is traditional infrastructure? And I think someone else echoed that question.
Yeah, so in the context of natural asset strategy, traditional infrastructure most like refers primarily to things like roads and drainage ditches, so things like that don't really incorporate natural systems. So we wouldn't think, for instance, of a forest or a tree stand as being traditional infrastructure, but it does provide shade. It provides pervious surfaces for water to drain into the soil, and so those types of services would be the natural asset services. And then traditional infrastructure is typically like your roads, your sidewalks, your water pipes, your sewer pipes, and all those types of pieces of infrastructure that we traditionally count as part of our asset management strategies. So I think that answers the question, but yeah, I'm happy to leave it there.
Great, thanks, Patrick. Thanks for the question. Okay, so I'm not seeing anyone on screen right now, so going to the chat, what is meant by natural areas being accessible? And how is this balanced with protection, which is mentioned in the vision, but not in the goal? Not all sensitive ecosystems can be at the same time protected and accessible.
So that's a really great question. And I think, there certainly is a balance that we'll need to meet in terms of which natural areas have the ability to kind of have trails and perhaps, accessibility built into them so that people can have the opportunity to really connect with nature and to connect with some of these natural areas and gain that awareness and appreciation for the natural systems that we depend on. So I think there certainly are some parts that where it might be a very sensitive ecosystem where we would want to kind of ensure that people aren't necessarily trampling on sensitive environments or that we aren't desecrating essentially these very sensitive natural assets. But in other cases, we also want to make sure that people have the ability to appreciate nature and be a part of it as well. So there certainly is a balance there that needs to be implemented in that kind of thinking.
I think an example that I would use in this regard is when you have a wetland area and you provide like a boardwalk type of structure to invite accessibility, but you're also at the same time protecting the wetland because you're directing people to a boardwalk as opposed to walking on a trail or trampling over the vegetation. So you can, in some cases, you can achieve both. But yeah, I think great point that in some cases there are very sensitive environments that we want to highly protect. Okay, I'm seeing some other questions in the chat here. Bernadette just making the comment, I think calling man-made infrastructure traditional is confusing. I think perhaps built infrastructure would be more clear. I think that's a great point. Or conventional infrastructure might be another term, because traditional, yeah, it might be a bit of a confusing word for some. Thanks, Bernadette. That's a good point. And Jody has asked, can protection be added to the goal on natural areas? We'll certainly look at that, Jody.
Yeah, I think that was also a comment that we heard through one of the dialogue sessions with the environmental groups. So it certainly is something that I think has been identified as a bit of a gap, Jody. So thanks for bringing that up again.
And Spring has asked, natural asset strategies, is this like triple bottom line accounting?
Rob, do you think you can answer that question?
I'd say a little bit. I mean, triple bottom line accounting, for those who haven't heard that term, is where we try and account and balance for the environmental, social, and economic values at the same time. So in a way, it is Spring. I think what we're trying to do with the natural asset strategy is recognize, first of all, that natural assets provide value to the municipality, just in the same way that conventional built infrastructure provides value. So if you have a wetland, for instance, it performs the function of stormwater management, flood control, it provides biodiversity, it provides potentially water purification. So it's providing all of these services, which if you didn't have them, you'd have to provide built infrastructure to replace those. So it has a definite value, but it often isn't accounted for in municipal accounting. And so I think there's a suggestion here through a natural asset strategy that we start to try and appreciate and account for the values that those natural assets bring. And so if they're lost, it's like, okay, we've actually lost something of value here. It's not just a nice thing, it's actually something that has real tangible value. That's the idea behind it. And to try and, the natural asset strategy kind of tries to take into account both the built infrastructure and the natural assets and bring them together in an overall infrastructure strategy for a place. Because traditionally, for many decades, we've tended as a species to overvalue the built infrastructure and undervalue the values of that the natural environment are providing. And so it's trying to bring some more balance to that look at infrastructure.
Right. Yeah, thanks, Rob. I'll just comment that it's very difficult to evaluate though the non-financial assets, and difficult and expensive, I guess, to do that. I don't think it's a modest undertaking, but it's a good idea, I think, but probably difficult to implement.
Yeah, there's an organization called the Municipal Natural Assets Initiative, which is a nonprofit organization that has done a lot of great pioneering work in several Canadian municipalities. Gibson's is one that comes to mind. And so I think the techniques for that valuation are becoming more and more well understood and well practiced. But yeah, it's not. I agree. It's not a simple thing, and you can take it to a very deep level, of course. But there are different levels of that we can apply this thinking to.
Right. Thanks. Yeah.
All right. Any final questions on this topic? I am not seeing any. If anyone else sees a question that I'm missing, please let me know. But at the moment, I think it's time to move on to the next one, Patrick.
Excellent. Thank you, Rob. So moving into the next OCP theme, a very important one around climate action, of course, and some of the results from the phase 2 engagement activities, what we heard from participants in those engagement activities. So the first being that community involvement, education, and awareness is really important to support individual and collective action on this front. New and existing development should be constructed or retrofitted for energy efficiency. So understanding that building emissions are one of two of the most important throughout the district. So there's building emissions, there's transportation emissions, and those two are the biggest emissions, or the biggest contributors to emissions. And so also understanding the district should maintain greenhouse gas emission targets and reduce its carbon footprint. Public transit and active transportation are really key to encourage sustainable ways of getting around North Saanich. So trying to address some of those transportation emissions here. Looking at different levels of government partnerships, so understanding that we can't make progress on this front without, partnering with some of our other levels of government, and ensuring that climate action is coordinated and impactful in that way. And finally, energy efficient buildings, increasing waste diversion, regenerative farming practices as well for a community like North Saanich that has so many agricultural lands, and protecting the natural environment, of course, are also popular ideas. So the first sort of policy direction is around GHG reduction targets. So all official community plans are required to include GHG reduction targets. So we're asking the community through the online survey and at the open houses and through these types of activities, how aggressive and how bold the community would like to see some of its targets, so that we understand, once we have an idea of how much progress, how many reductions we need to make, then we can kind of facilitate a bit of an action plan on how to achieve some of those reduction targets. And so we're giving sort of 3 different options: aggressive targets that would be over and above the reductions that are in line with the BC government. So that would be sort of the second option, to just kind of align ourselves with the BC government targets of 40% less than 2007 levels by 2030 and 80% less by 2050. And finally, modest targets that would see us just a little bit below the BC government targets. But understanding that currently the OCP, we did a little bit of modeling on GHG emissions in the earlier phases of this project, where if we just without changing any of the climate policies and programs at the district today, business as usual forecast shows that only 3% reductions in net emissions would occur by 2030, and an actual increase in about an 18% increase in net emissions would occur by 2050. So this is probably one of the biggest reasons that it's important to update this official community plan and to look at how we can be active players in the reduction of greenhouse gases in the community. Another key component around climate action is around sea level rise. So looking at these low-lying coastal areas and floodplains that are especially facing, this threat of sea level rise, and planning for sea level rise means preventing development in some of these areas that are vulnerable, and concentrating restoration efforts like open spaces and floodplain uses in these areas instead. So really the key policy direction here is to prevent further residential, commercial, or industrial developments within these vulnerable areas, and to restore shoreline environments to protect against storm surges that would create erosion, and also to enhance biodiversity and wildlife habitat. Energy efficient buildings, again, is a key component of any climate action strategy. And so looking to explore the idea of development permit area guidelines for energy conservation and the reduction of GHGs. So this could include guidelines for solar ready homes, and also exploring the use of incentive programs like those that are offered by federal and provincial governments for homeowners to retrofit their homes to improve on the energy efficiency and decrease GHG emissions. We're also looking at electric vehicles charging stations and how to incorporate stronger requirements for EV charging stations in new development, and to facilitate that transition to EVs a little bit more quickly. In terms of sustainable transportation, so looking at investing in new walking and cycling paths that connect neighborhoods to popular destinations. So essentially trying to, get people out of their cars just for a few different types of trips throughout the community if they can. But also looking at considering the proximity to things like transit, jobs, and local services when we're making land use decisions, especially those related to new housing, so that people have the opportunity to either commute in a shorter distance to get to the places that they need, or work close from home. Work with BC Transit and neighboring municipalities is also important to align with the OCP and the Peninsula Local Area Transit Plan. So we understand that BC Transit is planning a rapid bus route along the Patricia Bay Highway. So understanding that link and trying to kind of find the benefits of that rapid bus service and ensuring that as many people as possible can perhaps take advantage of that really effective bus service is also an important piece of creating a sustainable transportation network. In terms of waste management, so promoting a circular economy, one that's increasingly waste-free, so where waste that's generated from one industry can be reused or recycled by another local industry. And we know that especially with the strong agricultural sort of character in North Saanich, there's definitely some opportunities here, especially within sort of different farming practices. So we're really excited about that and kind of exploring this idea a little bit further with the community. So we'll open it up again to questions around climate action and the policy directions here.
Great, thanks, Patrick. And just a reminder, because a couple of people have joined us late. So if you would like to ask a question, you can either write your question in the chat and we'll read it out for you, or you can put up your digital hand, and you do that by choosing reactions and raise hand. And Laurie again is the first to raise her hand. Laurie, what's your question?
Yeah, thanks. Well, the first one is about the greenhouse gas reduction targets. I actually don't see what the action item or the policy direction is. What I read is an explanation of how targets really mean nothing if municipalities aren't held accountable. So I wonder, is the policy direction to create an action plan, or is it to set new targets? And if it's to set new targets, there needs to be an accountability measure in there or something, because that is pretty scary. And then I'll just, my other one is on sustainable transportation. I think the language to consider proximity to transit jobs and local services when making land use decisions related to new housing is really weak. I think it should say prioritize proximity to transit. Those are my only two comments. Thank you.
Thanks, Laurie. And yeah, if I can just respond real quickly to the GHG reduction targets, we are looking to gain some feedback from the community on what the right kind of boldness of emission reduction targets would be for this particular OCP. So yes, we are looking to just set the target, but then the other policy directions within this policy theme of climate action would be the ones that seek to put those reduction targets in action and to achieve them. So there would likely be, but I understand the comment there that perhaps there's a climate action strategy that also needs to kind of emerge out of this OCP to make sure that we're monitoring that progress and that we're making good progress towards those targets.
Yeah, perhaps I can comment on that, Patrick. I think there's a need to integrate. Currently we don't have any climate change policies in our current OCP, so there's a need to have some high-level policies that can start to flesh out that roadmap as to how we will achieve those targets. But I think there's also an acknowledgement that following the adoption of the OCP, there's probably a need for a further climate action and energy plan to get into some real nitty-gritty of how we achieve those targets as well, to ensure that we're looking at all the actions, and so that we have all the tools in the toolkit to achieve those targets, whether that's through not just OCP policies, but also addressing things in the zoning bylaw to require charging stations in all single-family dwellings, for example. So looking at municipal operations and the like, audits of our buildings and facilities. And so there's a need for a broader climate action energy plan to address some of those high-level policies in the OCP.
Great, thanks, Brian. Thanks for the question, Laurie, and the comment. Anybody else on this topic? Not seeing, oh, I'm seeing one in the chat here. Great. Bernadette, will you be providing GHG greenhouse gas estimates and other implications to the environment with the land use options you propose? I think all land use options should be examined through a climate lens.
Yeah, it's a really great question, and I think what we hope to do is certainly do a bit of modeling work in the next phase once we have a bit of a land use option that is preferred and recommended, and then we can tailor the strategies to that particular land use option so that we understand what needs to be done to achieve the targets. But at this stage, for the different land use scenarios that are being presented, that work has not been done yet.
Yeah, I would just add that the process to model greenhouse gas emissions from land use changes is quite complex and difficult. Like, I think we can provide kind of orders of magnitude estimates. Getting detailed is a major exercise though, and there's a lot of factors that go into it. So it's quite hard work to do that, but we can provide kind of directional comments about how land use responds.
And I think we are definitely looking at these land use options and everything in this plan through a climate lens as well. I think it's so important that this OCP, compared to other OCPs that the district has done, as well as other OCPs across the province, that we look at this issue of climate change and look at this plan through a climate change lens so that it's integrated into what we do. Traditionally, a lot of municipalities have done their OCPs and then they've done a climate action energy plan separately. And some of that was because there was funding available to do those climate energy plans. But we're definitely trying to ensure that we are integrating those two issues, to integrate land use, transportation, as well as other initiatives to ensure that this plan is being looked at through a climate change lens, first and foremost.
And one of our sub-consultants on our team is Integral Consulting, and they are leading that sort of portion of the OCP review process by looking at climate action and the policies and the impacts that those would have on GHG reduction. So we'll certainly be working in coordination with them to ensure that, that climate lens, as Brian was speaking, is applied throughout the plan.
Great. Thanks for that. So Nancy, you have a question.
Yeah, actually, I'm sorry, I'm sort of repeating what people are saying, but in my opinion, it's worth repeating. Lori's comment about accountability, I just don't think we can stress that enough. We have seen over and over again and time again that we can set targets, but they really don't mean anything unless we're accountable to meeting them. So I think that there has to be something in the OCP about the importance of accountability and the commitment of the municipality to meet those targets. And also around decision making, I agree, Bernadette, to the extent that we want to have some decisions considering climate, that using the climate lens when we're making decisions about land use and all of the decisions that are made. I would argue that climate change perhaps should not be a separate one of the categories, but perhaps it should be an overriding category for the OCP. And in that way, then we could use that lens in all of the different buckets or themes that we're talking about. Thank you.
Great. Thanks
Yeah.
for those suggestions, Nancy.
I really appreciate that suggestion, Nancy, and I think it's something that we've also heard in some of our earlier dialogue sessions about wanting to really apply that climate lens throughout the document so that it's not just one little chapter that doesn't really link up to all these other policies. So certainly something that we're considering here. So thank you for that.
Yeah, and I think it's just worth mentioning that it's unlikely that once we get to that document, when we get to that draft plan, there won't be just a chapter on climate change. There's probably going to be a chapter on climate change, but also there'll be climate change policies within each of those other policy areas to ensure that those climate change policies are integrated within all those other chapters of the document. Going back to the first point, it's also once Integral, we're saving Integral's time and effort for when we get to that draft plan stage. And if Integral then come back and start to analyze and start to look at what those targets or what those emission reductions could be. And then when we present that draft plan to council and then to the community, and if the community and council don't think those targets are ambitious enough, or then there may be a need to review those policies to be more ambitious or to achieve greater reductions, and what that may mean in relation to buildings, transportation, and how do we get there.
Great. Thank you, Nancy, for that. Barbara's asked, are the targets only for North Saanich or for the region?
Yeah, yeah. So the targets are only for North Saanich. Each municipality is required by the legislation and the Local Government Act to set its own targets.
But there are also regional targets, like the region has set its own targets as well. Okay, anybody else want to ask a question or make a comment about this particular theme? I do want to recognize that we do have one person joining by phone, and you may not be able to put your hand up. I recognize that. So if you did have a question or a comment, feel free to just unmute and ask your question. Okay. All right, Patrick, let's go on to the next topic, please.
Thanks, Rob. So the next topic is, or theme is around agriculture and food systems. So just a few things that we heard over the course of phase 2 engagement activities. First and foremost, that efforts should focus on supporting local growers and a self-sufficient district food market. Improved access to local food is very important for community health and well-being. There's a need to reduce barriers, especially for new farmers that are having trouble accessing agricultural lands, whether it's due to price or access in other ways. Existing agricultural land should be protected for current and future farming use. There's an opportunity to promote more sustainable and innovative farming practices, like regenerative farming as an example. There's also a very keen interest in supporting farm markets and farm stands. So some of the policy direction that attempts to, again, respond to the feedback that we heard. So the first being around agricultural hubs and food processing. So the idea would be to support development of a food hub as a shared use food and beverage processing facilities that offers farmers access to processing space, equipment, expertise, and resources to support their businesses. So a bit of a shared space for some of those processing facilities, given that there is a real lack of processing facilities on the south end of Vancouver Island right now, and many farmers are having to kind of send produce and crops out to the mainland for processing space. Also, the idea of exploring the potential of a farm village on rural lands in North Saanich. So these would be on lands that aren't within the agricultural land reserve. And a farm village, for those of you who don't know, is a small cluster of farming households that get to share a piece of farmland together, as well as the infrastructure needed to farm it. So it's a little bit more of an affordable model in some cases, and it provides that access to farmland for those farmers who are just starting out. We're also exploring the idea of a permanent farm market. So the idea would be of having this sort of permanent, multi-purpose, covered gathering space for the farm market to help it expand, not only its reach, but also perhaps its operating times as well. And so this would also ensure that any kind of farm market activity is protected from the elements and can certainly be a bit more attractive for those who want to go to the market on a Sunday or throughout the week. Another key component here is farmland protection guidelines. So the idea of creating some new development permit area guidelines for those properties that are adjacent to farmland to ensure that those properties incorporate landscape buffers and other design measures to reduce the conflicts that sometimes occur between farmers and other types of users adjacent to those farmlands. So things like residential, commercial, and industrial developments. Looking to also address food stands by perhaps allowing food stands in a wider range of areas for greater access to local farm produce. And also agribusiness and agritourism. So understanding that these are value-added types of farm uses that can support farmers in their business operations. And so we would be looking to consider allowing more of these types of value-added uses. Of course, those that align with the agricultural land reserves regulations. So things like wineries, farm retail sales, and other types of activities like that that celebrate the crops and the food that's being grown on the farm. Also, one of the land use scenarios has a particular direction associated with it. That's around designating all the lands within the agricultural land reserve for agriculture, and thereby increasing the lands designated as agricultural by 3% in comparison with the existing OCP. It's only a few exceptions remaining, so the Sandown lands remain as special agriculture given the special uses that are occurring there. Park lands that exist within the ALR would remain designated as park, and the Quelsett Elementary would remain as community use. But essentially, this is one of the ways in which I think there could be better alignment with the agricultural land reserve policies, and also with the hope of perhaps getting a bit more more land under food production or under farm use as well, farm production in general. So with that, we'll open it up again to comments and questions here in relation to agriculture and food systems.
All right, so first question in the chat is, what does support for a food hub look like in an OCP?
Yeah, it's a very good question. And so support might look like essentially a policy item that says, you know, should a group of farmers or a particular association that has a project in mind that specifically perhaps for a food hub, that the OCP would lend its support. And so if that application would then, you know, be submitted to council or submitted to the district hall, then council would be able to point to the OCP and say, we went through this community process. We have a policy in the OCP that supports the idea of a food hub, and so we feel that, you know, we can allow this application to move forward. So it's really about providing the policy framework through which that kind of idea can be supported at the district. And it also allows staff to work in collaboration with those groups, with those associations who might be providing something in the future. So we don't really know exactly if there's a food hub that's coming online at this point, but if it ever were to happen in the future, the idea of supporting it would lend itself well to collaboration and cooperation.
Just also to add to that, Patrick, you know, it could be also financial support. So we do have a community agricultural reserve fund. So for those of you who don't know, you know, 50% of Canadian Tire's taxes go into a community agricultural reserve fund currently. Obviously, there's two parcels that remain undeveloped, and therefore, again, a percentage of those taxes could go into a community agricultural reserve fund and then be used to help with assistance for that facility, or be used to match funding that could be accessed through provincial or federal grants.
Great. Thanks, Brian.
And if I may, it may also be a collaboration with some of our neighbors. So I know in Central Saanich, there's a project that's opening up right now that's looking at a food hub for Central Saanich. So it could also be looking at, you know, some of our regional neighbors and looking to kind of collaborate together to give some of this space so that we can all, so that farmers have access to it across the region or even the sub-region.
Great. So Laurie, you have a question.
Yeah. First, I want to say that I really appreciate all the hard work that's gone into this by the project team, and I think it looks really great. So please don't take all of my remarks just as criticism. But we heard from a local farmer that efforts need to be increased to support farming practices and reducing the cost of production. And these policy directions don't speak to enough. They don't speak enough to supporting production unless you're into communal living, which is okay for some people, but not for a lot of well-established farming families. Are going to switch over to communal living. They speak to processing. They speak to buyers and the marketing of it. They speak to, preserving agricultural lands, which Brian says that we're already doing a really good job of, but they don't speak enough to actually supporting these agricultural lands to be producing. Thank you.
Anyone would like to respond?
I think the policy direction around agricultural hubs and food processing, though a food hub is primarily around, shared facilities for processing food. It certainly does reduce cost in terms of, not having to ship your crops, your produce elsewhere to be processed. So the closer it is, the easier and the less costly it is as well. And the idea of a farm village as well, that is kind of touching onto that communal living aspect. So we're certainly aware that there's no single policy item, I think, that's going to have a huge impact on the affordability component of farming here. But I think these two types of policy directions here start to look at exploring that topic in a bit more detail than we have in the past. But I appreciate the comments, Lori. There certainly is perhaps a lot more that we could do as well. And I'd invite any kind of ideas that folks here might have as well, if there are any.
Yeah, no, I think to echo that, I think, we've done a fantastic job at protecting agricultural land from development over the last 20, 30 years with the introduction of the ALR. But what we haven't done a good enough job on is increasing the productivity of that land. So, I think, that's always a challenge for local governments. It's about building partnerships with the farmers. It's about building partnerships with provincial governments, Ministry of Ag and the ALC, as well as our own Ag Commission, to try and look at strategies, policies and proposals that can actually increase that productivity and work with that farming community as much as possible to try and make that happen. I think Patrick and Rob do have an amazing sub-consultant on their team, and once we get into that draft policy development, we'll be looking to her, Ione from Uplands Consulting, and this is what she does, is advises local governments on farming strategies. So we'll be looking to Ione to work with us to help us to develop those policies that can take us to the next level.
Great, thanks. And I know that Carly has put the link to the Central Saanich Food Hub study in the chat as well. So if anyone is interested in following up on that study that is going on right now, check out that link. Okay, question from Maya regarding ag hubs and food processing. This question is for everyone. This initiative has been talked about for a while, I understand, with the support of SIP and other municipalities. What's the status and why does it not seem to have any traction? And I think, I think the concept does have some traction. And as we've just heard, Central Saanich are moving forward with a food hub study. So it does seem to have quite a bit of support from producers in the region who have expressed interest in the idea of a food hub and food processing to occur in the region. Like anything else, it takes a while to move it forward, though. Anyone else want to comment on that? Let's keep going. From Kaylee, will a farm village concept be considered in designated areas, or will it be presented as an opportunity in a more concrete form? So I guess maybe looking for some more detail about what this involves, Patrick.
Yeah, so I think the idea behind the farm village is that we would provide some kind of policy direction that says, this type of farm village would only be supported within rural lands and non-agricultural land reserve lands. So we don't have a specific kind of location in mind, though there are some sort of farming, rural types of lands that are outside of the agricultural land reserve in the district. And so those might be the most attractive for that kind of new use or new kind of farm village. And so I think that's generally where we want to explore that policy direction. But you know, we also want to keep it relatively flexible so that, you know, there is perhaps the opportunity for groups to come forward. And if there is a piece of land somewhere else in the district that really lends itself well to this type of thing, then, you know, exploring that idea may also be good. So we don't want to be too prescriptive, but we certainly want to give a bit of locational criteria, but there's not a single property that we're pinpointing here.
Yeah, and just to echo that though, Patrick, if there is any landowners who are involved in this process or on this call tonight that may have a site, then we'd be interested in hearing from them through this process to ensure that we can try and look at those particular sites in greater detail through this process.
Great, thanks, Kaylee, for the question. Nancy.
Sorry, wrong button. Yeah, I don't think you've talked about this, but it's my understanding that we have a very low percentage of our farming land or agricultural land or whatever actually producing food. And is there any way that we can, should that be something that we include in the OCP? More food production as opposed to, I don't even really understand the issue, but hay versus food.
Yeah, it's a very good question. In our latest land use inventory of the agricultural land reserve in North Saanich shows that approximately 88% of the crops that are being grown are forage, pasture, so things like hay. So it's not a very, so it leaves about 12% of the rest to things like food production and other types of farming uses. So it's not a whole lot that's actually in specific food production, though, you know, pasture and forage does also contribute to food eventually in some indirect ways. So it's not all lost in terms of the food system. But yes, it is absolutely something that we're looking at, and unfortunately, or fortunately, I mean, depends on who you ask, there is no jurisdiction that the municipality can really have on telling farmers what they can farm on their land. So that's governed by the Agricultural Land Reserve. All we can do is really encourage and advocate for either those types of powers to be given perhaps a little bit more powers to the municipalities, or we can advocate for farmers and encourage them to put more of their farm into food production. But there's not a whole lot of leverage there that we have in terms of jurisdiction at this point.
But I guess through this OCP, we definitely want to come out of this OCP with where we will have some indicators. Obviously, we need to develop some indicators based on where we have a strong data set that we can then monitor over time, so that through this planning process, we can take a plan, monitor, plan approach. And so to see if we can influence at a policy level and have an impact on those indicators over time, so that we can monitor those indicators over time to see if we are achieving more land in food production or not.
Yeah, there's a really good comment in the chat here, just from Jody, who says that some forage production in North Saanich results in food for people, so things like feeding sheep, beef, dairy cattle. One operation in the municipality farms about 18% of the actively farmed land, grows grass, but also produces about 1 million liters of milk and 12,000 ponds of bees. So that's an example of where, you know, things like forage and pasture still do contribute to the food system.
Great, thank you for that question. Bernadette has asked, can you talk more about development permit areas? Perhaps putting that slide back up, please.
Yeah, let me just put it up here. So farmland protection guidelines are essentially just a way for when new development comes through to the district, it's an opportunity for us to establish or create buffers adjacent to farmland. So it could be things like a berm, a vegetated berm, it could be a tree line, it could be shrubs and bushes. There are guidelines by the ALC, standard kind of buffer design guidelines that we can incorporate into the OCP so that any kind of new development that occurs adjacent to agricultural lands incorporates these buffers and ensures that there's fewer conflicts that are occurring between the farm practices and whatever the other use is on the neighboring property.
It could also be setting the main building back from the farm property as far as possible on the lots as well. Okay, I think we've addressed that one. Have you consulted with the farm market board about the farm market? What have they said? And I don't think we have done that as of yet, but it's a good suggestion.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I think we certainly are interested in hearing from the farm market and understanding their kind of future plans. But I think also we're testing this out with the community first to hear if the community would like to see something like this, because then maybe we can work with the farm market to kind of perhaps embolden their future plans as well, given if there is a lot of community support for that. So it's not to say that we don't want to communicate with them. It's just to say that I think we're going through this process and seeking a little bit of direction and support from the community first.
Great. I think I saw Irfan had his hand up. Irfan?
Sorry, can I just interrupt just before just asking about the farm market?
Go ahead.
What are you proposing that is different from what we already have?
I think it's exploring the opportunity for a permanent farm market that would be, not just one day a week, but would have a structure and would be kind of an ongoing 5 or 7 days a week type of operation.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, Irfan, did you still have your hand up?
It's fine. It's okay. Thanks.
All right, thank you. Couple of questions or comments about housing. How can we provide housing for our young people who are required to work on these farms if we don't have affordable housing options for them? Especially now with fuel prices, are young workers reluctant to commute into North Saanich from more affordable areas like Langford or Souk? And Bernadette has asked, have you considered tiny houses for farmers? New farmers need to be able to live on the land they farm or lease.
Yeah, it's a really good comment that starts to show sort of the interlinkage there between supporting our agricultural lands and addressing housing affordability in the district. So we've heard from many farmers that it's very difficult to find housing for farm workers. And that there is no easy solution for that. I think when we were at the agricultural or the Community Agricultural Commission just a few weeks ago, we heard of a little bit of support or at least enthusiasm around the idea of perhaps a farming collective or co-op where farm workers would be able to have a bit more stable housing. Perhaps especially those who are not necessarily working full time on farms or so on. But I think there is certainly also the question of farm worker housing that's temporary in nature or seasonal, and so that's a whole other type of topic. But yeah, certainly finding affordable housing for farm workers and in that industry is certainly a challenge.
And it is worth mentioning, though, that farm worker housing is a permitted use in all our rural agricultural zones currently as well, subject to certain conditions, but it's essentially straight to a building permit. There isn't any rezoning required, or there may be some variances sometimes, but generally farm worker housing is a permitted use in all of our rural agricultural zones, if it is genuinely for farm worker housing.
Great. I'm going to try and just address a few points here.
Sorry, does that mean, Brian, that the farmers can build more housing for their workers?
Yeah, subject to if it's up to 90 square meters, that farm worker housing doesn't have any, it goes straight to a building permit essentially. If they want to build more than 90 square meters, they need what's called a non-adhering residential use application from the ALC.
So the policy supports it, but I think the issue is poverty. Like what I'm hearing is that farmers are living in poverty and that workers are living in 8 to a house. So housing on agricultural lands isn't quite the same as housing in community, right?
Correct, yeah.
Thank you, Laurie. Okay, I just want to address a few of the comments, and then we need to move on to the next topic. One of them is kind of asking why and encouraging us to include Ione in the conversation. This is Ione Smith, a sub-consultant from Upland Consulting, who's a real agricultural expert. So definitely want to do that as soon as we can. Bernadette, we need to remember that ag land is a land bank. If it's not used now, it will be needed later. So just protecting land is definitely worthwhile, even if it's not in productivity right now. Manure is also a significant and important resource that livestock provides to continue to feed and build the soil. Local farmers are clamoring for soil amendments like manure. Gary reminding us that what is holding back farming is profitability, and we need to remember that. And Maya asking where are farm workers housed now? Not sure if we can answer that question, but I guess there is some farm worker housing. Some people I would imagine are living, as we've just heard from Laurie, in large shared accommodation, and others are commuting in from elsewhere. Okay, thank you, folks. That was really great questions there and comments. Let's go on, Patrick, to the next topic, please.
All right. So moving into housing and affordability. Good segue here. So some of the results from phase 2 activities. So we heard from participants that housing options are needed for North Saanich to be inclusive of individuals and families of varying means and in different stages of life. So understanding that the demographics of North Saanich are changing and that people are generally aging, and so there is perhaps a need for certain types of things like aging in place. Housing should be focused in specific areas, so close to transit and services and areas with municipal servicing as examples. Preserving natural areas and rural landscapes should be prioritized over housing. So we shouldn't be, removing natural areas or rural lands from these types of land uses for housing, essentially. There's also skepticism that more housing should be built in North Saanich at all. And so we acknowledge that skepticism, but we certainly are looking to have a healthy discussion around this particular topic as well. So a few policy directions to try and address some of the comments that we've heard here. The first being residential infill. So the idea of providing more diverse residential infill housing options that are close to transit, services, and amenities, and really looking at the potential within the Terraces neighborhood here. So that's the neighborhood that's kind of framed by East Saanich Road and Patricia Bay Highway in the southeast quadrant that you see on the map here. It's close to the Panorama Recreation Center. So this could mean, options like small lot subdivision on some of these lots, attached secondary suites, cottage homes, carriage homes, cluster housing, or duplexes and triplexes. So really kind of exploring a wider gamut of forms of housing that can kind of fit within that single detached form that we see in the neighborhood currently. Another policy direction is around the McTavish Village idea. And so the concept here would be to focus low-rise apartments up to 4 stories in height along McTavish Road, incorporating townhouses behind here to better integrate with some of the nearby single detached homes behind there. To add a bit of a mixed-use component, commercial and residential units above at the intersection of McTavish and East Saanich Roads that you see just in pink there on the map. Providing new and enhanced walking and cycling connections between the Patricia Bay Interchange and the Panorama Rec Center. So essentially following McTavish and then down East Saanich Road, connecting the future bus rapid sort of hub there to the village center and down to Panorama Recreation Center. And also looking to use permeable surfaces and rainwater management strategies, especially for new developments to mitigate some of the drainage challenges that we've understand this particular area is facing. And so it's important to note that today the Area 1 boundary, which is currently within the OCP, is that white line. And so this is an area that in the regional growth strategy is currently considered outside of the regional growth strategy. So it's neither rural nor urban, and we're at a bit of a crossroads. And through this OCP update, we're hoping to determine how it fits within the community, within the regional growth strategy, and whether it should be located within sort of an urban containment policy or outside of it to be kept sort of rural in nature. But we do feel like this location here, and we've heard from residents as well, that the proximity to transit, the fact that these are serviced lands, certainly makes it an attractive location for a little bit of an area where some more diverse housing options can be accommodated, where we can certainly address some of the most pressing housing needs in the community. Looking at the current land use designation, the multifamily affordable housing land use designation, and looking to tweak it a little bit, because currently it requires that 100% of the units be affordable according to a calculation based on income. And so not a single unit has been built under that policy since 2018. So really looking to perhaps tweak that policy to include a mix of both market and below market housing units in the hope of making it economically feasible to essentially end up with more of these types of affordable housing units in the area. Looking at cottages and perhaps allowing cottage homes on residential lots that are greater than about 1/3 of an acre in certain areas. So through the survey and through the open houses and these types of engagement activities, we're certainly looking for feedback on where these types of cottage homes that you see in the photos there could be appropriate within the district. And then in terms of some of the draft policy directions, so looking in terms of some of the land use designations, so really looking at how we might be able to preserve some of the more rural residential kind of areas that are designated as such in the regional growth strategy. So exploring the idea of potentially changing general residential and country residential land use designations into one designation called rural residential, in line with that regional growth strategy, to really help keep these lands for rural and rural residential purposes of a form and density and character that support the working landscapes that's so important to the regional growth strategy. So the idea being that essentially this would prevent rezoning for future subdivision in some of these general residential lands, specifically in sort of the Deep Cove area and along the Land's End and in the Tayama Harbor area, where there's about 475 lots or so that have the potential to subdivide today. Given the feedback that we've heard around wanting to preserve that rural character and wanting to really perhaps focus growth in more strategic locations in areas where we aren't as connected or as to the kind of that rural character. That's also very, very important to residents. And so this is kind of that land use feature here that proposes to address that protection of rural character. So I'll just leave it there, and we can certainly answer any kind of comments and questions related to housing and affordability.
So there's a question from Kaylee. So what evaluation was used to determine the appropriateness of this area or any other? And I think she's referring to the McTavish Village and the infill area. Were criteria used such as walkability, amenities, existing servicing and infrastructure opportunities, etc.? So how did we decide on those areas, Patrick?
Yes, absolutely. So multiple criteria make this particular area fairly suitable or perhaps appropriate for greater densities or opportunities to provide a greater diversity of housing options. The first being BC Transit's plans for a rapid transit corridor along the Patricia Bay Highway with a transit stop right at the interchange with McTavish Road. So that walkability of being able to access transit is really key in that area. It's also an area that is currently serviced with both water and sewer servicing, so that's also very key. It's also in close proximity to the airport, to Sydney, and to the Panorama Recreation Center. So there's quite a bit of interplay there with the proximity to amenities and jobs that also makes it a relatively attractive place for that type of diversity of housing options.
Great, thank you. Comment from Gary, the projected population growth is far below that for the CRD or the province as a whole. It's also inconsistent with projected job growth. North Saanich has some responsibility to help address the housing crisis in this area. Increased density in areas currently zoned residential should be able to accommodate a reasonable growth. Thanks for that, Gary. Maya has said we reviewed the general survey. There's no question or clear explanation about the urban containment boundary, nor specific language about below market housing, which is another word for socialized or subsidized, is it not? Okay, so I think we'll just consider that comment. Thank you, Maya. Any hands up at this point? No, I don't see any. Carla, non-market housing seems to be the only way to create truly affordable housing. Is there any plan to work with the province or federal government or non-profit organizations to create something like this?
Yeah, so I think, I'll start off by just maybe answering one of Maya's questions there about the UCB. And we do have a Southeast Quadrant workshop coming up tomorrow evening where we'll be diving into this topic in greater detail with the residents of these neighborhoods. And so we'll be able to talk a little bit more about the specifics of the urban containment boundary and Area 1 and how it fits within the RGS. And so that's definitely going to be a big topic of discussion there. And really, I guess in relation to partnerships with the province, with the federal government, and with service providers, I think there's definitely going to be policies that look to explore those partnerships, that looks to support those partnerships, because we certainly understand that, affordable housing is not something that a municipality can take on its own. And so we've seen that with the development of the housing or Habitat for Humanity project and other affordable housing projects. They often do require partnerships, and so that's certainly something that we're looking at, and we'd love to include that type of language in the OCP. I think that speaks to those types of partnerships.
Great. Claire has a hand up. You're on mute, Claire.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes, go ahead.
Okay, I'm a bit of a newbie here, so please bear with me. I wanted to say thanks for all the hard work, everybody. The OCP looks fantastic, but I do have a concern. I live in the Terraces neighborhood, and I am horrified, absolutely horrified, to think that lots could be subdivided. I live in the Lochside. I live off of Lochside in the very far corner of it. So I'm actually cut off from the Terraces by the highway. I've lived in this house since 1967. I grew up in this house. My daughter grew up in this house. My parents both died in this house. I have a large garden that I love. I do not want to subdivide it. I live off of that garden actually all year long. And if that's not affordable, I don't know what isn't. I have put up with the noise of the highway my entire life because of the view. If someone was to subdivide the lot in front of me, I would lose that view. I love that view. We bought this house for the view and for the size of the lot. And then for this to be changed all of a sudden and my property completely destroyed because of it, I'm horrified. I can understand one reason for wanting to put in more density in that neighborhood, or any neighborhood for that matter, and that might be to allow older people to live in their homes longer. One of the ladies that came to my door that was part of the Terraces organization said that she wanted her kids to be able to look after her, and they needed someplace to live, maybe in her home or in a carriage house or an infill of some sort. I understand that because I looked after my mom and we built an addition on the house so that I could do that, but it in no way destroyed somebody else's view. I can understand maybe basement suites or putting in an addition above a garage, as long as it does not destroy somebody's view. All those terraces are built on a hill. They all want their view, I'm sure.
Great, thanks,
So-
thanks, Claire. So
Some way to preserve the view and not to have somebody build a house directly in front of you.
great, you made your point very, very well. Thank you.
But
And-
I also want to say that the Terraces is in no way close to amenities. I get McTavish,
Mhm.
but I don't understand the Terraces being densified because they're not close to a transit hub. They're not close to services. So I don't understand why the Terraces.
Patrick,
So
do
I
you want to address it?
Yeah, so I mean, I really take to heart your comments there, Claire. I mean, I really appreciate the passion that you've brought to that discussion. And I think, you know, the idea that we're showing here in terms of residential infill, it seems like you might be somewhat open at least to things like secondary suites and cottages, if it's done in a really sensitive way, right? If it's done in a way that really respects, for one, the topography, the views, and the character of the neighborhood that you live in and love, right? So, you know, that's really great feedback that we can incorporate into any kind of future or policy that that would move forward if it does. So I appreciate that, and we'll definitely take that into consideration. I think one of the reasons why the Terraces is seen as an area perhaps well suited for this type of housing is because it is, you know, there's relatively large lots that are of an older vintage home, so they're not as new as some of the other homes throughout the district. So they're coming along to an age where the redevelopment is quite attractive to some folks, that there is that potential, that so really wanting to make sure that it's done in a way that is perhaps addresses some of the housing needs in the community, and that aging in place kind of opportunity, I guess. But I certainly hear your thoughts. I hear your comments, and we'll definitely take that into consideration. And
Okay.
I hope that you come
Thank
to the
you.
Southeast Quadrant workshop, because I think there are certain things that we can do to kind of, you know, look at the design of these types of housing units and ensure that, you know, that it works with the topography and that views aren't negatively impacted.
I can't come because I'm on vacation. I'm actually
well.
sitting in my car. That's why I'm in this way.
Well,
And,
and just to echo what Patrick was saying there, Claire, you know, this plan is obviously a long-term plan, first of all. It's not changing zoning. So if somebody did want to subdivide, they would need to go through that rezoning process. And so the OCP is used by staff, council, and the community to then review development applications. And as Patrick just mentioned, there's there's a need for infill guidelines or how we sensitively infill new development into existing neighbours needs to be done with care, and it needs to be ensured that we have potential mechanisms that we can put in place, such as residential infill guidelines that can be used to ensure that some of those things that you just mentioned can be addressed.
Okay, it has to preserve the views. That's the main thing.
Great, and we have heard other similar comments.
And just one further comment, Rob. So this, I acknowledge that the terraces, there isn't the services or amenities directly in this neighborhood, but this neighborhood is still relatively close to some amenities such as Panorama Rec, the schools. It's a short bike ride away or a short car ride away. It's only a 5-minute drive to the McTavish Park and Ride facility. So a 5-minute drive, whilst obviously we want to encourage people to walk and cycle as much as possible, a 5-minute car drive is still better than someone driving 20 minutes or 30 minutes from somewhere else in the district to better utilize that infrastructure at the Park and Ride, which is currently very much underutilized.
Great, thank you, Claire. I'm going to have to move us on. There is a little bit of background noise from somebody, so if you are not speaking, if you could please mute.
That's my kids upstairs, Rob. Sorry.
Oh, okay. Mine will be coming upstairs soon too. Bronte, I think. I apologize if I'm not saying your name correctly. Is it Bronte?
Bronte, that's okay.
Bronte, go ahead.
Yeah. I just wanted to comment on the housing. I think it goes hand in hand with everything else, like we've said, like food, agriculture, jobs, environmental health. Sorry if there's quivering in my voice. I feel like I'm the youngest person on here, so like I kind of feel a little cornered, but
you're doing great.
Thanks. I'm participating tonight because I just feel like there's a lack of representation from people my age. And to my knowledge, no youth engagement session. So here I am. I'm currently in a temporary subsidized student housing situation. I'm a nursing student, and I thank God every day that I'm here because I'm fearful, just the way the world is going. I'm fearful for my friends who can't find a place to rent. I'm fearful for the people my age who are literally living out of their car on university campuses, just paying for a parking pass. And that's how they're doing it. And I don't think that's acceptable at all. And I think North Saanich as a community could do a lot better. I like the idea of carriage homes, tiny homes, whatever. I would like to add the idea of supporting students to move in with elders or just young people in general. That's a great way to support aging in place. You know what I'm saying? So yeah, I just think we could do a lot more. I hear the emotion in people's voices because, letting go of a family home, that's a lot. And I can feel that. But this plan is for 2040. I will be 40. So I would just like to see some change in that way for sure. Thanks.
Thank you, Bronte, and just great job, and thank you for speaking up on behalf of youth. That's really important.
And please spread the word, Bronte, as well. Sorry, Rob, but please, Bronte, please spread the word to your fellow young people out there and try to get them involved in this process as much as possible. Or if you've got any ideas that you have to bring some youth together, then please drop me or Carly an email with some thoughts.
Yeah. Barb, Tommy, you have a comment. I'm sorry I didn't see you earlier because it's a different kind of hand raise, but go ahead.
Sorry, I couldn't get the hand up when I went into reaction. I'd like to speak to small lot subdivision, particularly in the terrace. And Clara, I totally understand your concern. You have lived in the house for a long time, and particularly your house has a particular, you have an interest in particularly in the view, and you deserve it. And I fully agree that anytime there is a subdivision approved, it should strictly be approved if the neighborhood is not impacted negatively by the subdivision. I am the one that want to stay in my house. I want to age in place. I have lived in the community for 36 years, and unfortunately, there's nowhere in North Saanich to go. There aren't any small places. There aren't any one-bedroom apartments where a senior could move to. And right now, my half-acre lot is too big for me. And luckily, my lot, if it was subdivided, would not importune any neighbor. It wouldn't shade any houses. There is no view to be considered. And it would allow one of my sons to move next to me. I could stay in my place. And I also find that particularly in our neighborhood, in the terraces where I am, there are a number of seniors that have exactly the same problem. They don't necessarily have a relative that could move next door if they could subdivide, but there are a couple of them that would be able to subdivide, sell the lot, and use the money to stay in their own home and hire somebody to look after them. There's another couple that I'm very familiar with who would like to subdivide because their children that grew up in the neighborhood would like to live somewhere, and they know that they can't afford to live in North Saanich, but if the parents subdivided their lot and are willing to help the children, they could find probably some housing somewhere else. But the parents are not in a position right now with a big lot without subdividing to help their children. And so there are very different reasons for people wanting to subdivide their big lots, and mainly for somebody like myself, over 80, I can't maintain the place in the way it should be maintained. And if I am forced to sell, somebody could come and take my big lots and put there quite different buildings than what I had envisioned by building a single family home. So I think we need to look at small lot development very carefully, but first of all, there are not that many lots in the terraces that could actually be subdivided. But for the ones that can, I think that should be supported. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Barb. Appreciate that perspective. I do want to just quickly kind of acknowledge a couple of other perspectives. So Tanya writes about McTavish having to accommodate the development for all of North Saanich. Historically, the terraces have been declined for sensitive infill for favor of the appearances of large lots, even though these large lots support sensitive infill. How will the OCP address the issues of offloading affordable housing and sensitive infill to one area like McTavish when other areas are viable? And Maya, kind of similar comment about McTavish residents do feel like the sacrificial lamb. We ask all other residents to consider that. Thanks for the comment, Tanya.
Yeah, if I may just make a quick comment here. I think, in relation to that, sensitive or residential infill type of concept, we are looking at cottages as something that could be applied in a broader range of neighborhoods on lots that are larger than, say, 1/3 of an acre. And that is, and we're seeking for input on where that might be appropriate throughout the throughout the district, whether, that would be appropriate for other neighborhoods other than, the terraces, that may be interesting as well. So I don't think that, it's necessarily about picking on one particular neighborhood and avoiding that discussion with others. But I do think that, there's also a history in the McTavish area of it being currently the place where that multifamily land use designation exists. It's one of the areas that is neither in or out of the regional growth strategy. So there's a bit of a historic precedent there that certainly lends itself to this discussion. But if you are aware, if you do have ideas for other viable areas for this type of development, by all means, we'd love to hear it, and we'd love to discuss that a little bit further as well through this process.
Great, thank you. Thank you for all the comments. A number of comments kind of supporting what Bronte said in the chat as well. So Bronte, thank you for speaking up. Also, actually, there's one more important thing to say. Kaylee has pointed us to Saanich's implementation for garden suites as an example of policy change that then has had an incremental infill impact to a neighborhood. Overnight, folks don't all apply and build new residential units at the same time, but over a medium to long term. Saanich has produced data around this, which may be useful. Concrete example on uptake of gentle infill. So thanks for that, Kaylee. All right. Okay. I think we're going to go on to our next topic here, if that's okay. Thanks very much for the good perspective, folks.
All right, let me just share my screen. Oh, it's already there. All right, so looking at the phase 2 engagement results in relation to healthy community, just looking at some of the things that people have mentioned. So communities should prioritize accessibility and walkability through public transit and safe active transportation infrastructure. Access to daily services, recreational amenities, and parks is needed in each of the district's neighborhoods. Housing affordability and diversity is really key to supporting some of those healthy and livable places. We also heard that rural, peaceful, and quiet lifestyles are very important to preserve in North Saanich, and that there could be more hubs of social connection that really foster that sense of belonging and support for all ages. Improving active transportation is really important, and access to community services and amenities, while providing more public spaces together is also important. So some of the ideas or policy directions here that we're taking into consideration and we're putting out to the public for feedback. The first being this idea of neighborhood nooks. So neighborhood nooks are small gathering places in primarily residential areas that are intended to encourage connection, promote small scale entrepreneurship, and strengthen neighborhood character and identity of those neighborhoods. It could be a small little cafe, a little ice cream shop, or other types of little small shops or services like that. And so the idea would be to allow some of these neighborhood serving shops and or cafes at a crossroads somewhere within walking or cycling distance of residential areas. So some of the areas that were kind of floating out there are Queen Mary Bay, Ardmore, Dean Park, and the terraces, though understanding that, certainly we're asking residents if these are appropriate places and if there may be other places throughout the district that would be appropriate for a neighborhood nook. We're also looking at this idea of Deep Cove community hubs. So looking to complement what exists in Deep Cove today. So there's the Deep Cove Elementary, the Deep Cove Market, Fire Hall, and Co-op Gas Bar. They're clustered right along West Saanich Road there between Wayne Road and Clayton Road, with additional and potential mixed use residential and commercial development. So that mixed use component could be, relatively smaller in scale than I think what we're considering in McTavish, but looking to essentially see if this is something that could really strengthen the community hub that already exists in Deep Cove. And so that could also include a bit of a multi-purpose community gathering space to be used for things like community events and performances, things like a band shell perhaps, with some parking as well. We're also exploring an updated community amenity contributions policy that would essentially clearly lay out some of the desired amenities for new developments to contribute towards. So when a new development goes through a rezoning application, staff have the opportunity to ask for contributions that go towards certain types of amenities. So things like perhaps playgrounds, trails, access to the waterfront and beaches, library services, childcare, arts and culture, and other types of amenities. So we're certainly interested in hearing, from the community if there's other types of amenities that these developments could contribute towards. Heritage and archaeology is a very big topic on the peninsula, and especially in relation to Wasanich communities. And so the idea here would be to partner with Central Saanich, the town of Sydney, and Wasanich communities to create what we're calling a Saanich Peninsula Heritage Strategy. And this would be informed by Indigenous knowledge and provide greater direction on how to protect some of the significant cultural and archaeological sites along within the peninsula. And so this is something that has come up with the engagement with the Wasanich Leadership Council, their technical advisory committee, and is very important to them because currently the database, the provincial database that looks at archaeological sites, just is not as comprehensive as I think Indigenous communities would like it to be. Also looking at age-friendly communities, so incorporating things like accessibility and safety features for youth, seniors, and people with disabilities into public spaces and new buildings, and looking to also cater services and programs to members of the community of all ages. Childcare is also a very important topic here. So we know that there's a real lack of childcare spaces on the peninsula. So looking to permit childcare uses in a broader range of zones could perhaps help alleviate some of that and bring online some more childcare spaces. But also a big component here, similar to affordable housing, is really supporting the partnerships and that collaboration between service providers and some of the local facilities as well to deliver more childcare spaces. So that takes us to the end of the Healthy Community OCP theme. And so I'll just stop sharing and see if there are any comments and feedback on these policy directions.
There was one earlier from Nancy who said, I'm intrigued by the neighborhood nook idea and have seen these done really well in some municipalities. I have heard concerns mentioned that this is just the beginning of overdevelopment in these areas. Could you give us an idea? Oh, it's disappeared for me now. But I think it was, can you give us an idea of how we could regulate or prevent essentially a coffee shop becoming something more, or preventing overdevelopment of these areas? So how do we prevent a neighborhood nook from becoming a larger commercial development that impacts the area? Anybody want to take it, Brian?
Oh yeah. I was waiting for. I thought Patrick was going to answer that, but yeah, happy to answer that. Yeah, we've got a number of mechanisms that we can use to, particularly in relation to a neighborhood nook, they would have to go through either a rezoning process or a temporary use permit, and therefore through those processes we can control, through conditions, through restrictive covenants, through the zone itself, as well as then making them go through a development permit process to ensure that the form and character is also controlled, as well as addressing other issues that may come up through that process. So there would still be a public process, and issues may come up through that public process that can be addressed when the application is presented to council.
Great, thanks, Brian. Let's see. Where is the neighborhood nook proposed in the Ardmore area? I don't think I've seen this on the maps provided at the open houses last year.
Yeah, again, we haven't specified any specific location per se. This will be something that will be initiated by a landowner or the community and would then be assessed on its individual merits. So there isn't necessarily specific locations. Ideally, they will be at the intersections where they're close to where people live, but it could be driven by a particular proposal. So, for example, in Ardmore, I did have a conversation a few weeks back with the new cidery that's opened, Victoria Cidery, which is just to the east of Ardmore, and they were talking about, oh, could we have a coffee shop if we were a neighborhood nook? So, it doesn't necessarily have to be a specific location. It could be a more generic location, and a bit like the Fickle Fig. It's a specific location, but there could be other examples out there that could work.
Great. Barb, I see you still have your little check mark. Is that, did you have another comment? No, you're okay. That's from before. If you're able to take that one down, that would be good. It might be difficult. Laurie, you're up next.
Yeah, thank you. I like this section. I think there's a lot about connecting people in here and helping to create that sense of connection and belonging. A lot of really great ideas. I love the idea. I live in the terraces of a neighborhood nook nearby. What I don't I think the policy directions don't do enough to talk about something that's already been mentioned a lot about young and old to live here. Like, while there is this topic of age-friendly topic, that it's mostly about services and programs and safety, but it doesn't talk about the fact that those people have really limited resources or limited energy to actually live in a community like this. And that's where I get confused, and it's hard to kind of separate some of these things out from housing and affordability. But the other thing that I don't see is around diversity. How did any of these statements or policy direction statements talk about ensuring that people from diverse ethnic backgrounds and socioeconomic backgrounds are a part of this community? And because they're here, but they're struggling, and how do we make them feel more connected and belonging here, and as though they belong here? And the other thing that I think is odd is that there feels like there is still a divide between Indigenous and non, and maybe the work is still to be done. I know that you guys are still working on this with the Hispanic people, but I think healthy communities also really have places and opportunities to celebrate culture, and how we live in the middle of 5 Indigenous communities here, and how do we become more connected and whole as a community? And how can our OCP have policy statements that support reconciliation? So that would be, I know it's still a work in progress. My last quick comment here is around the childcare. I know that there's a lack of childcare on the peninsula. I don't know if there's a lack of childcare for North Saanich. Maybe there is. But I'm confused because our MLA was talking about the fact that our schools are emptying out, our school populations are falling. So do we have a lack of childcare? How big of a gap is that? And what's happening to the trend in that demographic if at the same time our schools are? So I think that there's an assumption that we need to support more childcare, but at the same time I hear that that population is becoming smaller. So.
Great, thanks, Laurie. Anybody like to address any of Laurie's points or comments?
Yeah, I think Laurie's comments on sort of diversity, inclusion, equity, it's so important, and so we certainly know that when we make land use decisions in a community, that has impacts on equity. It has impacts on who can essentially live in the community and who can't. And so these are all considerations that we certainly need to grapple with. And we are hosting, or we will be meeting with the Saanich Leadership Council once again this phase to further develop policies that address things like reconciliation, that address further topics of interest, especially around housing and economic development, because they are very keen to partner on those types of topics. And so, absolutely, I think it doesn't show the full gamut. These policy directions that I'm showing here doesn't show the full gamut of conversations that's being had with the WSANH Leadership Council, but we certainly hope to have a really robust set of policies that address reconciliation and speak more full-heartedly about the history of these lands and seas and to the history of the WSANH peoples as well in the OCP. So that's certainly on its way, and we're making good progress there. In terms of childcare, there was a recent CRD childcare study that was done, and so there are some specific numbers that are associated with that lack of childcare space and the large wait lists that exist to try and get children or into those childcare spaces. So I don't have that report, or Brian, you might be able to comment a little bit more on that.
Yeah, it was a North Saanich report. It was done 2 years ago, so a very up-to-date study, and it's obviously was done to help inform our OCP discussions. There were some recommendations in that study, both for our OCP as well as our zoning bylaw, and so we'll be, once we get to that policy development stage where we're crafting policies, we'll be looking back at that housing at that childcare study to incorporate some of the findings. Also from in relation to schools, we do have there is a formal requirement to consult school districts after second reading and prior to third reading, but we have been engaging the school districts, have been involved in this process, and the good thing as well to mention is that obviously all 3 municipalities are updating their OCP, so we're able to engage with them as 3 municipalities with the school district to ensure that our OCP or our long-term planning can then influence the school district's planning, so that they'll have our population projections, and they'll be able to use that population projections and data to help inform their school district planning as well.
And I'll just note that Carly has put in the chat the childcare study, I believe. So if you do have more questions about that particular report, you can certainly follow the link that Carly's put in the chat there and read more about it. Oh, Rob, I think you're muted.
Sorry, I was just saying thanks, Laurie, for the great questions and comments there. Kaylee had a comment that CAC, Community Amenity Contribution Policy and Guidance, is fantastic for all areas of the community, would suggest in the neighborhood one-on-ones to feel out the priorities for each area. So essentially trying to establish what kind of amenities each area would like to see through those CAC policies. So that's a great suggestion, Kaylee. Maya, funny story to break up the tension. We canvassed a house that was all for development, but not houses. They wanted a bar to have a beer that they could walk to. Thanks for that story, Maya. And Maya, again, sorry, this is from Tanya. Neighborhood pubs like the Prairie Inn have been a long-standing gathering and social place for our 19-year-olds to our 90-year-olds and walking distance to the neighborhoods surrounding them. Great. Okay, question. Is the current MOU draft with the WSANH Council included in the OCP? I see both the OCP and MOU include housing. So Patrick, could you just talk to kind of how we're taking the comments we're hearing through the WSANH Leadership Committee process and incorporating those?
So some of the draft policy directions that you've seen here tonight and that you'll see in the draft OCP are directly in relation to those conversations that we've had with the WSANH Leadership Council, and so we're looking to incorporate that into the draft OCP, and then again in the phase 4 invite further feedback on the whole suite of policies really that are contained within the OCP. So within that, there will be sort of an implementation section that speaks to how do we strengthen our partnerships, strengthen our relationship with WSÁNEĆ communities. So it could be the establishment of an MOU, it could be the establishment of servicing agreements and other types of relationship building activities as well to further progress on truth and reconciliation. So we've heard a lot about, needing to have, a more focused kind of educational approach where, and cultural sensitivity training perhaps for staff. And so there's all sorts of things that we're discussing with the WSÁNEĆ Leadership Council, and we are really looking forward to include some direction, some guidance there in an implementation section for the OCP.
Great, thank you very much. Thanks for the question. Okay, I think we're going to move on to the final topic, Patrick. I do note that there are a few additional comments on housing, so we'll get back to those if we have time at the end of the session. But let's go on to the last topic.
Great, thank you. So the final topic is on jobs in the local economy. So again, a few points on what we heard in phase 2, that efforts should focus on encouraging small scale local businesses, that business activities should respect and be compatible with natural areas and farmlands. Business activities should build upon the district's strengths, and that's primarily focusing on things like agricultural production, environmental protection, and the marine industry. Housing options and accessible transit services are really important to attract, young workforce to sustain local businesses. So I think we heard a little bit about this already. But again, also new opportunities for things like home-based businesses, remote work, the circular economy, and the technology industry should also be explored. So a few policy directions to respond to this. So within that McTavish Village concept, the idea would be to support a mix of shops and services and perhaps some light artisan manufacturing. So things like maybe a woodworking shop or small things that have, perhaps few impacts or are lesser in impacts in terms of the types of uses that would be allowed within this type of mixed use development, but still relate to that rural character and to rural industries. And so that would be within sort of that pink color there at the intersection of McTavish Road and East Saanich Road, where that mixed use component would be located. I'm also exploring the idea of green and circular economy. So again, this is one that would encourage local industries and businesses to collaborate and to manage their waste in more sustainable ways. So it could be the development of this green economy strategy, and also the district can kind of play the role of facilitating those discussions between different industries and different business organizations so that they are aware of each other and can kind of work together to reduce waste. Light industry, so we know that there's been a recent upgrade to sewer services in the Mills Road and McDonald Park Road area. So reviewing some of the policies related to those industrial park parcels in that area to perhaps support a broader range of industrial uses is being explored, and also developing new industrial form and character development permit areas to provide more direction on sort of the look, the feel, and of course the design of industrial development so that it's safe and it's done in a way that really respects neighboring properties and sort of the rural and agricultural sort of character of North Saanich. In terms of marine industry and marine commerce, so really looking to align some of the OCP policies with the key findings and recommendations from the Marine Task Force. So that's been a long time coming, and we're looking to essentially find alignment there between the two documents, and also reviewing marine-based commercial policies to just provide more guidance on the development of marine surface areas. So these are types of marinas, piers, and docks, and especially in terms of addressing some of the challenges that are going to be faced in relation to sea level rise and biodiversity on the foreshore. So that brings us to the end of jobs in the local economy. Happy to take more questions and comments here.
Yeah, usual process, folks. If you've got a question, you can put up your virtual hand or write it in the chat. Brian's just noted that the in the phase 2 summary, we have a summary of the WSANH engagement process and the comments that have been made. Thanks, Brian. Okay, question from Barb. Where do Airbnbs fit in jobs and the economy? Would they be considered a home business? Brian, is that something you can address?
Well, that would be more for regulation in our zoning bylaw. So yeah, currently in the district zoning bylaw, temporary accommodation is defined of not less than 30 days. So essentially Airbnbs where they are less than 30 days is not a permitted use in the district zoning bylaw. Whether this, whether the plan will address, the old gig economy is a difficult one to regulate, but whether this OCP looks at, I think we have committed to, as part of the scoping report that council asked us to do back in March 2020, it was to look at some of the home-based business. We know that those home-based business rules are a little bit out of date and need updating. So whether the OCP provides some direction on a greater variety of home-based businesses, given the changing economy and with more people working from home, for example, and therefore an acknowledgement to try and bring those regulations up to date, and that the OCP could set that direction for when we do look at the zoning bylaw review post OCP.
Thanks, Brian, and thanks, Barb, for that question. Laurie.
Thank you. Just very quickly, I don't know if it fits in the OCP, but how do we have a conversation about jobs and economy without talking about the real issue that's around recruitment and retention? Because it is really at a crisis state now. I know the public service had like 250 jobs in Victoria that they couldn't fill last month. And we're a headquarters for provincial government. So I see businesses, and I've seen this for a number of years, where they're closing, restaurants are closing at 8 o'clock. They just can't, all of the nice services that we like to enjoy here around tourism and hospitality are built on lots of minimum wages. So is there a place in these policy directions that speak to understanding what the recruitment and retention issues are specifically for North Saanach's economy?
Well, thanks, Laurie. That's such an important topic, and we've certainly heard from some business owners and the chambers and airport and BC Ferries at Schwartz Bay as well, that one of the main factors is housing affordability and the ability to retain a workforce. They're seeing quite a bit of turnover in their staff because folks are a bit tired of the long commute where they might be traveling from across the island, from Souk or from other communities a little bit farther west, and that puts a lot of stress on those commuters. So they tend to want to see, or have a home close to where they work, and that's certainly not the case for many people who work in especially those lower paying jobs in retail or in services. So yeah, certainly something that we've heard in the community, that we've heard from some of the business stakeholders, and I think one of the key components here is trying to address housing.
Well, there's demonstrating those interlinkages between housing, jobs in the economy, childcare. They're all interlinked, but acknowledging though that as a municipality, we only have certain powers, and we need to build those partnerships with other layers of government, and the community is a bit of a shared responsibility to some extent. But just an acknowledgement that the OCP might not solve all our problems that we have. It's essentially a regulatory document or a land use document, but can help to identify issues, but it may not solve all our problems, and it might not answer all our questions that we have at the end of this process as well.
No, I think recruitment and retention is really complex, and it requires an examination of what those issues are for North Saanich. And like Patrick pointed out, it's lots of it is around housing, and that is within our power to help to address. So we can't do it all, but we do have to figure out what we can do.
Absolutely, absolutely.
All right. I'm not seeing any other questions in the chat or on screen right now on this topic. Oh, no, here's one. Okay, this is Gary. There is real inconsistency between North Saanich's population growth strategy and anticipated job growth. This inconsistency needs to be recognized and addressed. Thank you, Gary. I don't know if anyone wants to.
I think Carly can answer that question. I think Carly was around when those population and job growth numbers came out, and so perhaps Carly could comment on that inconsistency. We are aware of it.
Sorry, I've been in note-taking mode here, but yeah, what I can add to the employment numbers, originally when those came out to update the Capital Regional District Regional Growth Strategy, they were even higher than they are now as they were adopted. So yeah, it's my understanding when originally they were kind of building those numbers, they did consult North Saanich, and North Saanich worked with, the local employers being mainly the airport and BC Ferries to kind of get some qualitative and feedback into those numbers. So yeah, that's what I can add. BC Stats prepared those numbers for the CRD. So yeah, just the methodology that was used, but I will say that originally they were higher and we raised some concerns, and they did come down before they were adopted into the regional growth strategy as well as North Saanich's OCP.
But isn't there a commitment
Great.
to revisit those numbers fairly soon though as well though? So we should get a better angle as well as in that inconsistency in the near future.
Yes, so it's my understanding as the 2021 census data sets are released that when the new board comes in at the CRD level, that is one of the things that they would update in the regional growth strategy, and the board would determine kind of the scope of what that review would look like.
Great, thanks, Carly. Thanks, Gary, for that point. Just quickly from Tanya, BC Ferries and Victoria Airport employ shift work where working hours don't align with transit. Therefore, single occupant vehicles are forced to commute to work their 4 a.m. shift. Thanks for that, Tanya. And Bronte, you're on mute. Yeah.
Yeah, just in talking about jobs and affordable housing, is there any way that we can encourage more affordable rentals in North Saanich? Because it's obvious that we need more of a workforce because most of the population is retirement age. Is there any way that we can do that? Because not everybody's going to build a tiny home or extend their house. I'm just thinking like somebody sent me a link, but it's way up there now. I wasn't able to get it, but kind of like a senior young person situation that would entice people to live there for affordable rent while being helpful to the elder that lives in the big house in terms of yard work. I don't know. Yeah.
That's a really interesting idea, Bronte. Yeah, go ahead, Patrick.
Yeah, and there's two major types of rental housing. So you have your kind of rental apartments that, pretty typical type of rental unit where, it's within an apartment building of some sort. I think in North Saanich, there's a few, or there's maybe, I don't know that there is a fully rental focused apartment building in North Saanich, is there?
That's
so
right.
Yeah, so that's typically one option, to build a purpose-built rental type of apartment building, and another option is in the realm of secondary suites, so things like cottages, basement suites, and carriage homes, essentially where a current landowner would rent out an aspect, a piece of a housing unit on their land. And so that's certainly another place where if we expand, or if we have a little bit more permission for some of these units to come on board, that we can increase the vacancy, or increase the stock of rental units, at least in the district. But it is a very difficult challenge. I know the housing needs report noted that, you know, there's very low vacancy rates in North Saanich right now, so there is a strong need for more rental units, and those are really kind of the two main types of housing I guess projects that help address that.
And again, if we're worth mentioning again, we have certain mechanisms, certain abilities when somebody submits a rezoning application to address affordability to some extent. We can, we could have I think first of all, we're focusing in this process primarily on the land uses or the typologies of building types that we would like to see in certain areas. And then secondary to that, there will be a need to then craft or develop further policies that can address the affordability issue to some extent, so that when a landowner or a developer submits a rezoning application for, a larger site that may be identified for townhouses, we could then negotiate with that landowner or that developer to say, well, what is the mix of units? Are these all market housing, or is there a mixture of market housing, some market rental, some subsidized housing, etc.? So there's ways to then negotiate what may be achieve some of our objectives while still making some profit for the developer, to encourage him to come forward with that application to rezone a piece of land in accordance with the OCP. So it's definitely be looked at.
I like that, because my generation, it's not like we're gonna buy, right? Like we can't. Not that long ago, you could work at a grocery store and get approved for a mortgage, but that's just not the case. There's education, inflation also, right? So just encouraging developers to make it doable.
And I think developers acknowledge that. So, for example, in Victoria, you'll see most developments coming forward in the city are pure rental, because the developer knows that what is the market is for, and that they know that most people can't get a mortgage these days, so they're building what the market really wants, because they can still make money from that product. So
great, thanks so much, Bronte. That's great points, and a number of people have made supportive comments of the idea of multi-generational housing. I'll just read out this one from Maya. Beautiful idea, Bronte. I'm also a cultural anthropologist, and our Western culture does not typically consider ideas that involve multi-generational co-living and support. This is much needed. And we met neighbors who have a multi-generational family compound in McTavish. This is wonderful to see. And Sean, this speaks to lack of diversity and inclusion in some of the policies, as this type of care and residence Bronte mentions is normal in ethnic communities. And Laurie, also multi-generational housing also helps to address childcare. So great, thank you so much for that. So we're basically at our time. We have a couple more things we wanted to do before we close. So Patrick, I think you had a final poll for us, is that correct?
Yes. So before we get into, or while we get into sort of the next steps, well, what I'll do is I'll launch the next poll, which is just about participant satisfaction. So we just want to know how satisfied you were with tonight's virtual open house, which neighborhood you live in, and which age group do you belong to, so that we can compare it to some of our other engagement activities. So I'll just launch it here. I won't be sharing the results of this one, just so that we can kind of keep that somewhat confidential, but we will be providing, I guess, the results of the satisfaction results at the in the engagement summary report. Sorry. And so while you respond to the questions in the poll, I'll just do a quick overview of the next steps here. So in phase 3, the engagement activities that we are completing. So there's currently an online survey that is available. So we'd encourage all of you to take that online survey, to encourage your neighbors and your family and friends to also take the online survey. We've completed the set of resident group dialogue sessions that was all done last week. And this is the first of 3 open houses, of course. And so we will be hosting an in-person open house on Saturday, as well as another in-person open house on Thursday next week. And of course, we talked a little bit about the Southeast Quadrant workshop, which is happening tomorrow evening. And paired with this is, of course, the Indigenous Communities Workshop, which we hope to host in the coming weeks as well. All this feedback is going to feed into an engagement summary report, which we'll present to the advisory working group in July, and then finally presenting the engagement summary report to council by August 15th is where we're aiming. So I hope that that you'll be able to participate and join us at any of the other activities that are coming up. Again, the online survey will be on until June 12th. Tomorrow we have the Southeast Quadrant workshop, and Saturday at the McTavish Academy, you can join us, as well as the Deep Cove Elementary open house on June 9th. So you can go to connectnorthsaanich.ca to find all the information on these activities. And we thank you for coming out tonight. It's been a great evening of really respectful and constructive dialogue. I've really appreciated all the feedback. And so I thank you for coming out and participating in this activity and providing, you know, your passion and your love for your community through this process.
Thanks, Patrick, and everyone. This Southeast Quadrant tomorrow, is at the Presbyterian Church, is it? Okay, thanks.
So, yes.
I see Barb has a hand up. Barb, did you want to make a parting comment?
I just have a general question on the survey. I started the survey online and I got to the transportation part and I wanted to look at a link that was attached to it. I got there. When I was finished with it, I was thrown out of the survey. And I don't know, do I now restart the whole thing or did my survey go through half finished? Technically, I'm not very good.
Yeah, no, that's really unfortunate, Barb. I'm sorry that you had that experience. I think, and Carly might be able to answer this in a bit more detail, but I do believe that even if you get kicked out, it still records the feedback that you would have left already. Correct me if I'm wrong, Carly. So you might be able to just go back on and complete the other topics. But yeah, Carly, maybe you have a bit of experience with that.
Yeah, so my understanding is unless you've created an account and you've registered that you can't go back into that survey, but the feedback that you did provide has been registered. So Barb, if you know like approximately what time and what day you did the survey, please follow up with me and we can try and pick up where you left off, because I know one of my colleagues did that for somebody else today. But yeah, another option that people are looking at doing is we do have the hard copy surveys. So sometimes we'll just do it on the side and then input it. So there's a variety of options there. And again, sorry to hear that happened, but yeah, we did build it so the links would hopefully go in an external tab so it wouldn't take over your main browser.